So the purpose of this review guide, and we want to be clear here. So this review guide was developed for our division offices, specifically for the division offices to review indirect cost allocation plans for the state DOT. So if you've had a chance to take a look at that, and when I open it up here in a minute, you'll see that that is the intent and that was the focused audience for that review guide. However, that review guide, all the components that are in there are applicable to pretty much any ICAP that you review. Um, and I'll go ahead and just kind of bring it up right now, and we'll kind of just show you the layout of it real quick, and then we'll kind of I'll turn it over to Bob, and Bob can do some summarizing of the stuff that's in there. So as what you're seeing now is section 2. Let me bounce up to the beginning here real quick. So for the FHWA divisions, and actually most of the ICAPs that you all might be reviewing, section 1, it's got preliminary review and the financial statements, trend analysis, and so on and so forth. But if you'll notice, section 2 has pretty much the same stuff. However, section 2 is specifically for indirect cost allocation plans, and goes into a lot further detail of kind of the stuff we've talked about for the last few days, like cost allocability and allocation bases and so on and so forth. We really focus on section 2. So there is a section 3 that talks about narrative cost allocation plans, which is helpful. And then section 4 goes into the centralized services piece of an ICAP. But today, and most of the time, what you're going to see in this document that is the most helpful is the section 2, and that's what we're going to go to right now. Let me just kind of show you how this thing is laid out so you'll able to navigate it in the future. So the first part just starts off as kind of general, and we'll come, Bob will hit some of that when he kind of goes through the simplified version that we did. But let's focus on just one of these objectives, and that way you'll understand how this thing is laid out. So the objective is the higher thing that you're looking at, the higher element of the package that you're looking at. And then under these objectives, there might be some various elements that correspond to that objective that you should be looking at. And then even under these elements, there are sometimes a few or maybe none, but some consideration. So these are just things to think about while you're looking at that very element. So that's kind of how the whole document is laid out, just so you kind of have an understanding. You can see objective 5 here, or I'm sorry, 7, if I can narrow down slowly, or 8, I guess. Well, let me get it right here. Oh, I went too far, sorry, having a scrolling issue. You can see some of these, yeah, it was objective 5. Objective 5, they have a whole bunch of various elements. So I'm sorry, I'm scrolling too fast, but there's some considerations, and then it goes to the next element. This document here was produced off of an HHS document that was very old, and we took the information from Department of Housing, and that they had a really good SWICAP and an ICAP review guide, and we took that information and used it to develop this specifically for FHWA divisions. All of that being said, once again, the information in here is great. Everything in here, I shouldn't say everything, but most everything in here will apply to any ICAPs that you're reviewing, with maybe the exception of the de minimis rate and the narrative cost allocation, which is a whole different animal. So all of that being said, you have a copy of this. If you'd like to follow along with Bob, is what he's going to do is just pull up the summarized checklist instead of us going through each one of these individually. based on our review of our examples yesterday, we think and hope that you have a pretty good understanding of what we laid out yesterday in Appendix 7, all those various requirements, and B, what those examples look like and where those requirements from Appendix 7 and other areas that we've talked about over the last couple of days are found within those various examples, and what you can kind of expect when you're looking at one or even developing one. So all of that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Bob, if you want to share your checklist, it's entirely up to you. Let me just turn it over. I'll let you explain further kind of what we did. And as you go through, Bob, if I need to pull up or share the actual example, we can definitely do that.
Okay. Can you see my Word document?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So just to let everybody know, and this goes to what Eric was just saying, that review guide was written for Federal Highway Administration. So, it could be a little bit difficult for, say, Caltrans or for a local government if you want to use the review guide, because the other good thing with the review guide is you can use it as you're developing your indirect cost allocation plans, because these are the questions that either we or Caltrans as the pasture entity are going to be looking for and wanting to address throughout that review guide. But what, as Eric mentioned, since that is written more towards federal highway, one of the things that we were thinking that might be helpful, and I just wanted to just give you an example. And so what I did was, and this could be something that Caltrans could do. So basically you could take that review guide that we've come up with, take the objectives, which are the higher level, things that we want to look at, and then we have the elements and the considerations under those. But if you just take the objectives, put them into a Word document, and I'm going to show you, this is kind of what I did here, just for the very specific purpose of this class, to help you kind of walk through that review guide and develop your own checklist for either developing an indirect cost allocation plan by bringing in those objectives of what you need to make sure you're covering, or developing your own review guide for your specific organization. So really, this is just a Word document that I plopped all of the objectives into, and then based on California and based on who we're talking to, which is Caltrans and local governments, I created this like really quick checklist. So I wanted to go through this, and it does follow along, like Eric said, it follows along pretty well with the actual review guide. So if you want to follow the review guide, you can, or you can just follow right here on the screen. So basically, the first thing you need to think about is if you're a pass-through entity, say Caltrans, and you receive a package, an indirect cost allocation package from one of your subrecipients, the very first question you need to ask, and this would be also what you have to ask as a non-federal entity who's developing an indirect cost allocation plan, the very first thing you always have to check is, do we have a cognizant agency for indirect cost? Caltrans, that's the first thing that you're going to have to ask when you get these packages is, do you receive any direct federal funding? Because if a non-federal entity receives any direct federal funding, then that agency who provides the direct federal funding is the cognizant agency for indirect cost, and it would be the predominant amount of direct federal funding, and they would be responsible for reviewing and approving the ICAP. It would not be a Caltrans responsibility. If they have an ICAP and it's been approved, then if you look at this first bullet here, if yes, the non-federal entity should submit the indirect cost rate agreement from their cognizant agency for indirect costs. So they'll be submitting that to Caltrans, and that agreement should show what is the rate, what is the effective period for that rate, what is the base that they're going to use, and they should identify how fringe benefits, equipment, and depreciation is handled within their indirect cost plan. If Caltrans determines that they are the responsible party to review and approve the ICAP, then the next step would be, okay, let's look at the ICAP. Let's see what they're asking for. The next step on this would be a de minimis, but you may already have identified that they're choosing not to use a de minimis rate. But sometimes, we can offer this option, de minimis rate, because it is a lot less burdensome to a non-federal entity. And if they receive, funding not on a regular basis, maybe they get an award every year or two, and it's going to be difficult for them to do adjustments. This 10% de minimis is a very good rate for those types of organizations. But as we mentioned, we have to remember, if they're going to choose a de minimis rate of 10%, they still have to have their systems or processes in place that only allows them to charge that 10% to the allowable costs and not charge the 10% to the unallowable costs, which would be these exclusions down here. And all of this comes right out of the definition in 2 CFR 200.1. So if we've determined that they're not going to use a de minimis rate, then we can move to the next and say, okay, we're going to start doing our preliminary review. So at this point, now that we're in step 3, and I'm pretending like we're Caltrans here, we're going to say, hey, we've checked to make sure that they don't have an indirect cost cognizant agency. They don't want to claim de minimis rate, and so they're submitting their package to us to review and approve their cost allocation plan. So the next thing that we want to ask ourselves is, have we reviewed their plans before? Is this a regular occurrence every year that this non-federal entity submits their documentation? We're familiar, we've reviewed it before, they have experience with developing it, we have some understanding on how things are happening. You have to ask yourselves those questions. And I think this is what, and I think Rodney mentioned this yesterday, and I believe Caltrans or Audits and Investigations supported it, is you use a risk-based approach, which I think is completely reasonable. I have no idea how many LPAs there are in California, but I do know that there are a whole lot of them, and the auditors don't have the resources to do a full in-depth review of every single item. So it's perfectly reasonable to believe and use a risk-based approach, but you have to ask this question. You have to say, do they have experience? Have we seen issues in the past with their rates? And that's going to really guide how much of a detailed review you're going to do on these ICAPs. Is what's the experience? Are there any significant issues? And that's going to guide how much work you're going to put into looking at these, is based on that. Then we need to ask, was it submitted within the required deadline? Because as we've mentioned a couple times, I know Eric has and I have, the requirements in 2 CFR 200 says that, oh, and look, Rodney says that there is an estimated number of 600 local agencies for California. So that is a whole lot that, I'm not sure how big the audits and investigation staff is, but it's probably not large enough to do full-blown reviews on 600 LPAs. Thanks, Rodney. So submitting it within the deadline is really important, because if you do have experience, maybe it's not going to take you that long to review and give them an approval. If it is the first time they're submitting it, or there's significant issues, or there's information missing from the package, then we really need to make sure that it gets submitted in time, and we have enough time to actually do all of the review that we want to get done before the effective period is happening. So if they have submitted it within the 6 months after their end of their fiscal year, which basically gives Caltrans 6 months to review and approve before they want it to be effective, then we can proceed to the documentation review. If it's a no, if they submitted it like, they're only giving us 1 month to review and approve because they didn't get it submitted within 6 months, that took them 11 months from the end of their fiscal year to get it submitted, then we may not have enough time to review and approve the proposal. And we have to consider that. And we're going to talk later when we get into the negotiations part, but this is going to be part of the negotiations. If you only gave us 1 month to review this stuff, and we haven't really ever looked at your ICAP before, then it's not very likely or reasonable to believe that we're going to be able to turn it around and get you an approval, by the time that they want the approval. So then the next question that we need to ask is, If we're not going to have enough time to get it approved for when they want to start applying it, if they have a prior rate, are they asking for an extension? Because the important thing to remember is all of our indirect cost rates have an effective period. Even a predetermined rate that's approved for 4 years still has an effective period of 4 years. So after that 4 years happens, at the end of that 4 years, that rate expires. And if there's not another rate approved on the next day after that rate is expired, then indirect costs cannot be claimed. They cannot be billed to projects, because remember, the cost principles say we have to have an allocation basis. Allocability is part of allowability. And if we don't have an allocation basis for indirect costs that's approved, then indirect costs are not allowable. So it's very important that we're not crossing our effective periods and having these periods of time where they're billing indirect rates and there really isn't either an approved extension or an approved rate, because those would all be unallowable costs. So we have to ask this question. I mean, this is all happening just when you're getting the package. You haven't even looked at anything yet. We're just making sure, and this is kind of how the review guide goes. It's got a lot of extra detail in it, so that's why we've kind of condensed it down here, because it would have probably took us 2 days just to walk through that entire review guide, going, element by element. So we wanted to do kind of this summarization to kind of put it in a better perspective. So then, if requesting an extension to prior rates, we need to provide a reason or justification as to why an extension is required, and that the prior rates that they're asking for an extension on are still equitable. So, they need to be saying, why are they not able to get their ICAP in within the required time frame? There has to be some sort of reasoning as to why they're not getting it in. So they need to provide that justification, and that's going to allow Caltrans or Federal Highway or whoever's reviewing and approving these extensions, a reasonable assurance that, yes, there is a good reason why they haven't submitted them. They're working on getting them submitted. We're approving an extension for a short period of time. And then we might want to look at, if we do an extension for, like, say, 6 months, when they come up with their actual rate or their new rate, is it more or less than what they've been charging as their extension? Do we need to do some adjustments on the new year's rate to account for that 6 months that they were billing the old year's rate? So those are all things we're going to have to also keep in mind and think about. And that's why it's important, if we can just get things submitted in time, then we don't need to worry about doing all this extension stuff. But it is out there and we have to keep it in mind. So this next section, like we were saying, we've basically received the package. We've made the determination, are we the responsible party or not for reviewing or approving? We've done our analysis on, did they submit it in time and everything? And so now the next step is, yes, they've submitted it in time. We're ready to approve it. So now we need to do that the initial preliminary review of the documentation to make sure that we have all the information we need. And so what Eric's going to do is, and this is the example that we were showing yesterday, but the first thing we want to do is look and make sure that all of the documentation appears to be present. So the first thing we want to always find out is, you're applying for an ICAP, so do we have a cognizant agency for indirect costs? So you can see, and this was the good thing about the Vermont example, is if you have, in the front part of this agreement, they have all of this pertinent information that we need. So basically, what type of rate is being requested, who the cognizant agency is, what is the effective period to apply the base rate. So we have our base period there. What type of a rate do we have? So Vermont's doing a predetermined rate for 2 years. They're using a allocation method of a simplified method. So they have one rate versus a multiple rate method, which is multiple rates. And then they show what their direct cost base is. So just having that in the very first part of the package is going to be helpful, because, you really need to know this information before you start diving into the data, because you want to know exactly, kind of understand what you're looking at. Then once we find out this basic information and we see the rate there, they're wanting to charge 150% rate. Now we need to support all of that information, support these numbers. So we need to make sure, do we have all of the sufficient backup documentation and subsidiary worksheets that support, all of these numbers? And so if you remember from yesterday, we had the narrative document that gave us all of the narrative information. They explained their accounts and how they've set up their departments and how they set up their pools and everything. And then we have this worksheet that gives us all of the data. And so one of the requirements of your direct cost base is that, and this is in 2 CFR 200 Appendix 7, is that you have to split your direct costs up between direct salaries and wages and other direct costs. And so when we looked at Vermont, they do show their direct cost base as direct salaries and wages, and they give us that number as a total in the methodology document, but they did have to split it out still. And so in this workbook, you can see here that they did split out their direct costs between direct salaries and wages, other direct costs, and then that grants, I believe, is like all of their contracts. This would be probably like contracts and grants. And then other directs would be, direct costs. It looks like they have just a few there. And then the base is all of those direct salaries and wages. So they did split up their direct costs into those different pots, and all entities, regardless of what your base is, even if you're going to use a total direct cost base, you still have to show, this is how much our other direct costs are, and this is how much our direct salaries and wages are, and combined that would be our base, and you still have to show those as separated. But we just wanted to show you here because we didn't touch on that yesterday. We were just kind of focused on the direct cost base because that's the base they're using. But we did want to show you that they did split out their direct costs like they're supposed to in Vermont. And so really, this is going to be the biggest, we want to look and just do an initial check because we're not doing a deep dive yet. We're still just making sure that we have all the information that we need to do the deep dive. And just making sure we have everything in our package. So it looks like we have our good backup documentation and worksheets. Is there a reconciliation between the financial statements and the accounting and budget reports? These worksheets are coming out of their financial statement, and they have their data universe that ties to their financial statements. Now, I can't remember, Eric, did Vermont submit their financial statements along with like their actual official financial statements along with
they gave you and I a link to their file, their share file, and so you and I took a look at it and kind of reconciliated those numbers on our own. They didn't actually use them as a complete package, but that might be something that you might need coming from locals. They might not have a file share system that you can access to go look at, but they did provide us access to their overall financial statements access, and we were able to take a look at it.
Okay. And so the other thing that's required is the org chart. So right in 2 CFR 200, it does say that an org chart is required. And in Vermont, they have an org chart within their methodology document. And then I think Eric copied and pasted this into the worksheet, but it still ties to the worksheet because they still use the same colors, the color coding, which basically identifies what is their indirects, what are their directs, and what are the exclusions. And so that's a really good way. And these are not, it's a requirement to have an org chart, but it's not a requirement to do this color coding or to necessarily identify your cost by department necessarily. Those are not necessarily requirements. That's the way it worked best for Vermont. That's the way it worked best for Wyoming. That's the way it works best for a lot of state DOTs because they do have specific departments that are primarily a direct department that do direct work. But it may not be the best scenario for, say, a local public agency. So you all have to figure out, you still have to give us your org chart, but you have to figure out what is the best allocation method that's going to work for you based on how you do business, based on your systems, based on everything. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. We're showing, and this, I think Margaret asked the question yesterday, we're showing you an example of a state DOT ICAP, but this does not necessarily mean that your ICAPs have to look exactly like this, but all of the objectives that are in the review guide are going to apply no matter what entity you work for. So that's the thing to keep in mind as we're reviewing the review guide and looking at this just one example, is the objectives are going to always be the same, but what it looks like may look a little bit different. So just keep that in mind. If this is the second time or more that this, we've reviewed ICAPs before, is there any significant increases or decreases in cost centers? That's something that's important to have, that historical information. So if you remember from yesterday, we have historical information in this methodology document, and then they also, while we just showed you the 2019 worksheet, or maybe it was the 2020, they gave us a worksheet for each of these years. So we could go out and look at that data for each of those years and analyze the historical numbers. And it was important in Vermont because this was the first time they've ever developed a plan. So, we made them go back, even though this is the first time, and look at least 3 years so we could get a kind of an average. And so it took them a little bit more time. They had to go back and look at multiple years of data, but now we have a historical to start with. And as we progress, this is a 2-year rate. We'll be able to say after 2 years, hey, let's look at your historical for last year. We already know your 18 and 19 historical numbers, and we can do a comparison and make sure we're not seeing big swings between their bases or big swings in their rate adjustments. Then, are there any deviations from the standard allocation basis? So normally, like we've been talking about, we normally see a base of direct salaries and wages, or we see a base of modified total direct costs, or we see a base of direct costs. If you're using some other sort of base or some other sort of allocation method, we're not saying that you can't. It just has to be an equitable allocation basis, and you just need to explain why you're using that allocation basis. And as Eric's showing on the screen, they described their entire allocation basis. They have a whole section on that. So, we should be seeing that. Why are you choosing the allocation base that you're choosing? Then once we've identified, okay, generally looks like we have all of our documentation. Do we have the transmittal letter? Do we have something from the non-federal entity that says, please see our attached indirect cost allocation proposal. We want to claim this rate for this period of time. And, they're asking for approval. We should be getting something like that. Then there should be a signed certification of indirect cost. So that would be the very specific wording right out of 2 CFR 200.
Hold on, I'm getting there.
Yep.
You guys remember it from yesterday anyway, but here it is right here.
Yeah, and like Eric mentioned yesterday, just copy and paste right out of Appendix 7 if you're a state, local, or tribal government, and put this certification in your ICAP. If you're a nonprofit, if you're an institution of higher education, if you're a public service, or I can't remember what the other ones were, but you may have your own appendix to refer to, and there may be a different certification language in those other appendices. But for the most part, state, local, and Indian tribal governments will use Appendix 7 certification language. Then if we have identified that we're missing anything, we need to make sure that we're reaching back out to the non-federal entity to start collecting that information, because we need to have all of the data in order to make an approval.
Yeah, let me jump in here real quick.
Yep.
Great statement. I think we mentioned it yesterday as well. And I think is what I mentioned yesterday, because I was asking some questions about kind of what the process is. So when you guys get an ICAP in for review, is there a cursory? Everything Bob just covered right there would be something like that cursory, making sure the package is complete. And the reason why we mention that is because if, time is of the essence, obviously. So if you do get a package in and you can do a quick cursory without even going into the numbers in detail, but you can at least recognize if they've got everything, then you can communicate and collaborate back with that organization if they are missing something, and get that ball rolling as you're working your own schedule in doing whatever else you're doing. And at least when you start to dive into the numbers, you have a complete package, and that's kind of out of the way. So that's why I was kind of curious to know if you guys did some sort of a cursory review as soon as you get the package, which doesn't take very long. As Bob, has just covered, there's just, a handful of things you've got to look to make sure that they're in there. And if they're not, then you can, put them on notice right away. It's like, hey, you got to get me this, you got to get me that. And then that, gets everybody working within that sensitive time frame for review. That's all I had, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. No, that's all true. And then once you have determined that yes, you have all of everything that you need, then, and we weren't going to necessarily do that today, but I'm going to go ahead and just talk through a couple of the things that we looked at yesterday. But that's going to be where you're going to do that deep dive into their data, kind of like what we did yesterday. So here's where you're going to start applying those cost principles. You're going to start applying the allowability concepts, and this is where you're going to start looking and saying, okay, how did they segregate their costs? Can I see what their direct cost pools are and what their indirect cost pools are? How are they identifying their cost pools? Are they by department, kind of like how Vermont did it? Or are they by cost center, or say object code or cost type, or is it a project-based type of analysis? Then we determine how do they allocate their costs. If you remember, and Eric, I don't know if you mind, I might just show Wyoming's really quick since they haven't seen that one.
Absolutely.
And it's a little bit different.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, I'm going to share Wyoming's. And so this is their most recent one, and I just got it from the division office. So this is for FY 2021. And it's based on the FY 2019 data. And let me just zoom in. And notice yesterday, if you remember what Eric said yesterday, that we sometimes say that ICAPs can be as big as like a phone book. Well, the Vermont one, I think, is 135 pages. This is 427 pages. But as you'll see down here, when we get into the table of contents, they have their entire financial statements in here. They have their audit in here. So that's why it's so big, but they have a lot of information in here. And one of the things that I like how YDOT did theirs is they have these, these different codes, A1, B1, C1, D1, E1, and you'll see why that's important here in a minute. But as we're looking at and applying the review guide principles, here's where we want to come in and say, okay, how did they identify their indirect costs? How did they identify their central services programs? Did they allocate correctly? Remember yesterday, or a couple days ago, when I showed you Wyoming and how they allocated their budget department across their direct departments by using a central services cost allocation basis, and they used direct budget dollars as their basis. Up here, they've identified what their direct programs are, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a sec. And then their cost summary methodology, and you'll see that, we did use, as Eric mentioned yesterday, Wyoming was our example when we were working with Vermont. So it does look a little bit similar, but it's not exactly the same. So let me just do it this way. So you can see here, one of the things that I liked about Vermont, which is a little bit different than what Wyoming did, and we basically used what Wyoming did to recommend to Vermont to do something a little bit different, is notice we don't see any of the information, the pertinent information, in the first few slides, in the first few pages. We got to really get down here. Here's our allocation basis. We have 629. It's total costs is what they're using. So total direct costs of 629,000. They're using a predetermined rate. But notice here we don't have what the period of time is. And so, our recommendation and my recommendation to Wyoming would be for the next one is, hey, let's put some of that information up front, but they do still have it in here. So we're not going to ding them too hard on it. It's still in here. You just have to dig around a little bit more to find it. So, it's just a recommendation that we would make. But you can see up here that they've identified, okay, here's our central services cost pool. So these are incurred for common and joint purposes and are not readily assignable to the cost objective. And they're not associated with a unique project number. But when Wyoming's talking about central services cost pool, this would be their DOT, YDOT central services cost pool, and not the statewide central services cost pool. Now they do charge statewide central services cost pool, but this one here, they're talking about their DOT central services. And that's kind of the example that I showed you, because Wyoming does a multiple rate method. They had to allocate their costs across their direct department so they could identify how much indirect cost do we have in this direct department versus this direct department. So they could come up with their individual rates by their departments or how they split it up. And I'll show you that in a sec. Then they very specifically identified how do they do labor or their fringe rate, and how do they do equipment. So it's very important that they're identifying, hey, we have a separate fringe benefit rate. And this is similar to how Vermont did it. And we're not including those costs. We're excluding those costs from our pools because we're billing those costs through a separate rate. And they do the same thing with equipment. And actually the equipment example I showed you yesterday was from Wyoming. Then here's all their indirect, they call them central services departments, but they're indirect departments. And I'm just going to go real fast. They identify them similar to how Vermont did. They identify them, they give us a description, and now here's their direct departments. So they define those. Notice here, they give us their department numbers. And then here's how they talk about applying their rate. So they very specifically talk about, this is how PeopleSoft, that's their financial system, and that's the financial system for the state DOT is PeopleSoft, and then they have a Wyoming state financial system that PeopleSoft talks to. But they basically say that they're going to set up this rate in PeopleSoft. They talk about how it's applied within their system, how they look at the analysis type, how they some of these things that they're collecting, like they collect 12 cents per gallon from all state agencies which utilize their fuel system. So they're, so they're excluding that out because they don't want to double dip. So they're deducting that from the central services. So basically, I'm not going to read through all this, but they're describing everything. Then here is where they're saying their effective periods. You can see how this would be a little bit better if we could see like all the pertinent information kind of all grouped together, because we already noticed up here on page, 2 pages ago what their rate was, but we didn't know what the effective period is until this page. But they still have it in here, so we're okay. They're a 4-year rate, and we're going to validate it every year. So even though they're doing a 4-year rate, on every year they're submitting to the division, hey, we're still good, because remember, we're doing a predetermined rate, so we negotiate something less than what their actuals are. And so here's how they're talking about they're going to calculate the rate. So they have an 11% predetermined rate, and they're going to apply that rate to new projects beginning on October 1st of 2020 and existing projects when the project changes to a new activity on or after October 1st, 2020. So this goes to what Eric was talking about yesterday. Your system has to be able to turn off and turn on the next rate, because a rate shouldn't be applied to a project for the life of a project. A rate is good for the life of the effective period of that rate. So if you have a project that's going to span 3 years and you have a fixed with carry forward rate that you have a new rate every year, then that project could have 3 different indirect cost rates, from June 1st or July 1st to June 30th of the first year, you have a rate of 10%. On July 1st of the next year, if your new rate is 11%, then we should be seeing an 11% charge there for the next year. And then if it goes down to 9% the next year, we should see a reduction down for the next year. That is something that a lot of people don't know. I have heard of states or local governments that say, hey, this is a 3 or 4 year project. We have a rate of 8% in the first year, and we're going to charge at 8% for the whole life of that project, regardless of what our indirect rate is 4 years from now. And that is not an allowable cost. That would not be equitable because your rate is different, or it could be different. Now, if you have a 4 year predetermined rate, yes, you could charge that same rate for 4 years. That's fine. But if it's an effective date or effective period for 1 year, you can only charge that rate for 1 year. So just keep that in mind, and you need to explain that and understand that. So here is where I wanted to really show you that WYDOT has multiple rates. So what they've done is they've calculated rates for all of these departments. And then notice here, they're saying not applicable, because even though they developed rates in order to be equitable, because notice it's a 16.79% rate for on the federal highway side or for their construction. For highway safety, it's a 20% rate. For their support services, it's a 213% rate, and so on. And they're choosing to only apply the federal highway rate. And that's okay as long as they did this breakout. They showed us that it's still going to be equitable. And now you'll see the numbers of how it's equitable. And so what WYDOT did is they did give us a worksheet, but for the most part, they have all of their documentation in this PDF document. So here's their org chart, and notice they didn't really, they do allocate by department, similar to how Vermont did, but they did not color code their org chart. So we don't know here which departments are direct or indirect, but if you remember, they said up above in their methodology, they identified by department number all the departments that were direct or indirect. So they don't necessarily have to do the color coding. That was beneficial and it's helpful, but it's not necessary. Oh, look here. So they basically took their org chart and this is something new. I haven't really looked at the 2021. I've looked at older WYDOT ones, but this is something new. So what they've done is they've further defined their central services or indirect cost departments on these extra sheets. Okay, so here's how they develop their rates. So this is their summary of their rates. And the thing I like about WYDOTs is they use these references throughout. So if you're looking at, if I want to find out where did they get this number from, I just got to go to D3. And notice down here, all of these pages are numbered. So I can come to D3, here's D3, and I can see where they came up with those numbers. So this is the consolidated rate for their ICAP. And they have the rate before allocated costs. So that was before them distributing their indirect costs across to their departments. And then after they have allocated those costs. And so I'm not going to go through this whole thing. I just wanted to show you, let me get to this last page here. Oh, let me just show you that this is how they did these are their individual. So this is the federal highway rate. So what they did was they identified by department all of their costs. They did identified their direct costs, identified their allowable indirect costs, identified their allocated central services costs, and then came up with their total allowable costs. And this is all for this federal highway rate. So these are costs that are coded to somehow in their system to this federal highway. And then they have, other codes to like aeronautics and to some of their highway safety and their other departments. So they've come up with this 16.79% rate for the federal highway program. And so then what they're asking for when it's all said and done, apologize. Oh, oops, I'm going the wrong way.
I think it was 11%, right?
Yeah, it is 11%. So remember, this is a predetermined rate. So they're not wanting to claim the maximum amount. And so even though they have a 16.79% rate for federal highway, and they have an overall rate, like a consolidated rate of 23% for the entire organization if they were to not do a multiple rate method. So they did the calculation, what would we be if we were a multiple rate method? What would we be if we just had one rate? And then they negotiated an 11% rate. So there's really no risk. We have really very low risk of overcharging or overbilling indirect costs. But like Eric mentioned yesterday, what is YDOT's objective? Their objective is not to claim the maximum amount of indirect cost. They want to get a little bit of indirect cost. They want to have some of their state dollars have a little bit more flexibility. So instead of using them for indirect types cost, federal highway is going to participate. They're getting enough for what they need with the 11%. And so it's very easy for them to develop this every 4 years, negotiate something that's significantly less than what they really are incurring. And it's low risk for us, and it's easy for them to apply, and everybody gets what they want. Most of their funds still go to the direct projects. A lot of it doesn't go to ICAP, but some of it does, and that's okay. So really with that, I really don't have anything else to show except for in order to do those calculations, you have to be able, oh, this is what I wanted to show you. So this is the departments. And one of the things, so you could go out by department and look at their costs that roll up. And then you can go into these references and see, okay, what is this adjustment, motor operation cost? So we could go to G55 and look at reference C, and it'll tell us what that is. And that's the thing that I wanted to show you all, because I really like that they do that, because it's easy to find stuff. And except for like if you're showing it to people and then it's hard to find stuff. G55. Oh, here we go. So here's where they put a lot of their explanations and methodologies. So here it is, G55. So we're looking at C, motor operation costs. The costs associated with the maintenance and upkeep are reflected in the equipment program. The vehicle aircraft uses charges are charged to the individual programs through PeopleSoft and Agile assets. And the other side of the entry offset is our uses are charged to the same program as vehicle offset. So they're doing an adjustment to take that out. And that's good. And we should be seeing that. And they're describing what it is. And so basically, I just wanted to show you that, the way they do their references makes it really easy to find stuff, especially if you do have a document that's 427 pages. So with that, I'm just going to open it up for questions, see if we have any questions on this information. I didn't want to, and Eric, if you want to I'm going to stop sharing and let's open it back up to ask anybody if you all want to share any of your local types of issues or questions or that kind of thing. Or if you want us to, we can still go through the review guide if that's something that you want to do. We're thinking, Eric and I talked yesterday after our meeting, and we really did go through that Vermont example in a lot of detail, and we could walk through the review guide with you and go through those cost allowability and cost allocation sections, but it's really going to be kind of duplicative of what we did yesterday. So we wanted to kind of go through that checklist with you and just kind of show you how you could take the objectives and kind of build your own checklist for reviewing or checklist for developing an ICAP, and making sure that you're keeping all of those considerations in mind. But we didn't want to do a duplicate review unless you all wanted us to. But we do want to hear about your local issues. We do want to hear any questions that you might have regarding the information that we've covered over the last 4 days, and any kind of issues you might see coming up in California. Anything else to add to that, Eric?
No, if somebody does want to either speak up and maybe ask a couple questions about anything we've covered in the last couple of days, that would be fine. Any issues that, you regularly run across, just kind of open it up right now.
I guess everybody's waiting for me to say something.
Margaret, is it you?
Yeah, hi. So, in my personal involvement, it has always felt as if Public Works, so this is a city municipality, it's the Public Works agency that is involved in obtaining the indirect cost rates. At least, and I'm under the impression it's just our agency. I don't know if there's another agency in the city of Santa Ana who's going through the same thing. The way how we fell into this, it was specifically about capital projects. And so I've never really reached out to see if there's somebody else who's doing this. But we do have expenditures identified, I guess, in our comprehensive financial statements and whatnot that exceed the amount of what Public Works does, and therefore it identifies a specific cognizant agency for us. But I was just wondering if and it might be PD that's getting some other federal awards of some sort that might exceed ours. I don't know, but just hypothetically, if they actually had the lion's share of federal awards that then identify a cognizant agency, but they're not going through, they're only charging direct, they're not trying to get an indirect cost rate. I don't know that to be true, but I'm just hypothetically. Does that still, our subset of that total, are we still sending our indirect cost rate proposals to that same cognizant agency, even though the whole city isn't participating in this exercise?
Yes, that is a very good question. And I'm going to use the example of like a state DOT. So the big thing that we need to remember is that previous to 2 CFR 200, we had one cognizant agency. We just said there's a cognizant agency for all federal agencies or federal programs. Now we have cognizant agency for audit and cognizant agency for indirect costs. So as an example, I'm going to use a state government as an example first, and then we'll talk about local government like what you're talking about, Margaret. So on a state government side, we say that HHS, Health and Human Services, is the cognizant agency for indirect cost for statewide government. So if the statewide government wants to claim central services, the statewide central services, then the state of California develops a plan, they submit it to HHS, and then whichever agency within the state of California that develops the SWICAP, the statewide central services cost allocation plan, then they bill all of the departments. And so the departments like Caltrans, the transportation department, while HHS is the state of California audit cognizant agency, Caltrans may have a different indirect rate than, say, the department, the California Department of Audit or the California Treasury Department or whatever. So they have to develop their own indirect cost allocation plan. So even though HHS is the cognizant agency for the state of California, now we need to look at, okay, who is the cognizant agency for indirect cost for Caltrans? Who provides the most funding? So that would be federal highways. So federal highway is usually the cognizant agency for all state DOTs. So now let's go to the local level. We have you said it was the city of Santa Ana.
Yes.
Okay, so we have the city of Santa Ana. Part of the city of Santa Ana has public works. It has the police department. It has all of the other different departments. The city of Santa Ana may have a cognizant agency for audit that reviews and approves the overall audit for the whole city. And then each of the departments, and this is to your point, Margaret, if your department of Public Works wants to develop an indirect rate just for use in your department, then you would look within your department who provides the most direct federal funding. If you don't receive any direct federal funding, then you would provide your ICAP or your fringe rates or your equipment rates to Caltrans or whoever provides the most pass-through dollars to you. So that's the way it should work. Now, it could very well be that the city of Santa Ana has a fringe benefit rate, an overall fringe benefit rate, and they want, all of their departments to charge that. I don't know if that's true or not. If they don't, then yes, if you want to claim those costs, you would have to develop your own rate for your organization in order to bill those, because they have to be allocable and there has to be some sort of a plan. So we may have to just do a little bit more analysis, Margaret, on does Public Works receive any direct federal dollars? That's the first question. And we're talking just Public Works, not the city of Santa Ana.
Right. No, I don't believe we get anything just direct. It's just about everything is, a application for a project that we've received an award from, and it has federal dollars, either with Caltrans or we have here locally OCTA, that's Orange County Transportation Authority, that administers funding.
Okay, so then I would say in that case that you would submit your ICAP specific for Public Works or fringe benefits or any other types of allocated methods to Caltrans or audits and investigations, or whoever in California is reviewing local public agency ICAPs for review and approval. Now, let me get Caltrans on the phone, or audits and investigations, because I'm speaking about your all's processes and I want to make sure that I'm not saying something wrong. So is that California's understanding as far as for your LPA program and the ICAPs that you're receiving, they are from entities that are not getting any other direct federal funding, similar to Margaret's Public Works office in Santa Ana, and they're submitting those ICAPs to Caltrans or audits investigations for review and approval. Is that correct?
Hey, Jonathan Cox from Independent Office of Audits Investigations. So we asked the entities to identify the funding they do receive to make the cognizant agency determination. So I guess it sort of depends. It depends on that. So I guess, was there a specific question on that?
Well, I'm thinking Margaret is wondering, is she sending her stuff to the right place? Is that what you're thinking, Margaret? Is that, hey, if our overall, because I don't want people to get confused on the cognizant agency, because it is a little confusing now that we have two. So it's really important when like as Jonathan mentioned, when audits and investigations gets a package from a local public agency for review and approval, the first thing that they have to ask, like we talked about just in the very beginning of today, is, does that entity, are we the responsible party? Should audits and investigations be the responsible party for reviewing and approving this? And in order to determine that, you have to say, do you get any other direct federal funding? So that's why Jonathan was saying it depends. In your case, Margaret, maybe the Public Works office in the city of Santa Ana or in some other city, maybe it's not in Santa Ana, but some other city where they do have a overall citywide fringe benefit rate that would be approved by a higher cognizant agency, and it wouldn't matter that Caltrans would have to review and approve it. But that would be up to that entity's. So it's your responsibility, Margaret, I would say, to check with the city of Santa Ana to see if there is a indirect rate that you should be charging that's approved by the city's cognizant agency for indirect cost, or a fringe benefit rate. And if there's not one, then the next step would be, okay, we want to claim that. We're not getting any direct federal funding. We're getting pass-through dollars from Caltrans that are federal highway dollars. So we're going to submit our package up to audits and investigations for review and approval. That's the way I think it should go.
Yeah,
And I appreciate it. Yeah.
and Bob, just to add to that, so if there is another cognizant agency, we still request that they submit that agreement or approval letter. That way we'll send out one when we verify that, so that they can receive the funding through Caltrans.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, those are the two checks. Is if there is a cognizant agency, then we need to, there may be some communication that we have to make with that cognizant agency. So yeah, I think that sounds good.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we ran into one agency where it was determined that FEMA was their cognizant agency, it was a grant with FEMA. Caltrans, is appointed as the cognizant agency in our stewardship agreement with FHWA. And for whatever reason, FEMA did not accept the agency's indirect cost rates as approved via IOAI and FHWA. So and we're just kind of curious, how do we direct, what happens when that occurs, and how does USDOT or FHWA assist and provide direction to the other agency who may be questioning the acceptance of a submitted ICRP or ICAP rate?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So the thing to remember is, and when we look into CFR 200, and we really didn't cover this, and it's kind of hard to find, but when we're talking about a de minimis rate, one of the things that it says is that a de minimis rate can be used by an entity that doesn't currently have a negotiated rate, and also meets the criteria in Appendix 7 in some paragraph of Appendix 7, which if you go to that paragraph, and I'm just going to share my screen so you can see it. Let me just share real fast, because it'll be easier to, and I know this sounds like it's getting off topic when I'm talking about de minimis, but you'll see what I'm talking about, Daniel, here in a sec. And this is a very important question that Daniel's asking, and I've seen this come up a lot. And ultimately, and it's not the greatest news, you're probably not going to like the answer. But if we go out here to Appendix 7, can you all see my my web page screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm coming in here to 2 CFR 200. I'm going to go down to Appendix 7. First, I'm going to come right here. If we come into cost principles, and let's just look at indirect costs. And then down here under indirect costs, it says, in addition to the procedures outlined in the appendices in paragraph E, any non-federal entity that does not have a current negotiated, including provisional rate, except for those non-federal entities described in Appendix 7 to this part, paragraph D1B, may elect to charge a de minimis rate of 10%. So now we're going to go to D1B in Appendix 7. So in Appendix 7, in part D1B, it says, a governmental department or agency unit that receives more than 35 million in direct federal funding must submit its indirect cost rate proposal to its cognizant agency for indirect cost. Other governmental department or agencies, so any entity that wants to develop a plan that receives less than $35 million and doesn't want to claim the de minimis rate. So this is where it's basically saying you can claim a de minimis rate as long as you receive less than $35 million. But if you want to claim something other than a de minimis and you get less than $35 million, this is the procedure you follow. Other governmental department or agencies must develop an ICAP in accordance with the requirements of this part and maintain the proposal related supporting documentation for the audit. And these governmental departments or agencies are not required to submit their proposals unless they are specifically requested to do so by the cognizant agency for indirect costs. So that this is a long lead up to answer Daniel's question. But basically, to answer your question, Daniel, if say a local government, Caltrans is a pass-through entity, we're approving their ICAP, then, and because they're only getting pass-through dollars, then there's an emergency event and they're getting some direct federal dollars and they want to charge an ICAP to those FEMA dollars. It is up to FEMA to decide if they want to accept Caltrans's rate or not. Now, you could very well, if Caltrans wants to get Federal Highway involved in negotiating, we could definitely get in there and negotiate and talk to them about this. But I've seen this happen before, and it's really the federal awarding agency's prerogative to accept or not accept a pass-through entity approved rate. Now, 2 CFR 200 is very specific and says if it is a federal awarding agency approved rate, all other federal agencies have to accept it. So that's where, if you are finding this issue and you want to bring in FEMA, and call Rodney from the California Division Office, and if he wants to bring in me and Eric or anybody else from Federal Highway to be on the call with FEMA, we can talk through with them that Caltrans is reviewing and approving these on behalf of Federal Highway as the pass-through entity. They are reviewing and approving these in accordance with 2 CFR 200, just like we would do as a federal awarding agency. And that we, in the division office, we provide training and we, provide oversight and assistance to audits and investigations in California in their review of these ICAPs. So, Federal Highway Administration believes that the rate developed and approved by Caltrans would be a reasonable rate. And we could come back and say that, but that still doesn't mean the FEMA is going to say, okay, we'll accept that. So probably what I would do with FEMA is to say, okay, well, this is what we approved. If you don't accept it, show us, they'll have to approve it. They'll have to review and approve that rate. But in an emergency event, I mean, it could be that they'll just say that they're not going to participate. But see, this little thing here puts us in a predicament, because this happens all the time. There are a lot of entities that don't get 35 million in direct federal funding. And if that's the case, they're not required to submit their ICAP. If they want to claim indirects, they can develop an ICAP. They can come up with a rate. They can reach out to their cognizant agency and say, hey, here's our ICAP. Do you want to review it? And I know HHS already has a policy in place that if you receive less than 35 million, don't even send us your ICAP, because they get so many ICAPs that are more than 35 million. They don't want to look at those small ones. So what does FEMA do in that case? They haven't approved the rate. And so does FEMA go and tell them, sorry, we're not going to accept your rate? They probably do, because they don't have a HHS signed agreement, possibly.
So Bob, I
Yeah.
can add a little bit to that.
Yeah.
So there is history with FEMA on this. This issue has come up a couple of times. And so it was raised to the resource center level. So Dan Parker, and then also he brought in our legal counsel, so Steve Rockless. And basically they concluded, just what you just explained, that was their conclusion as well. It's basically up to FEMA to determine if they want to accept the rate that has been approved by ANI, because ANI is a pass-through entity and they technically aren't the cognizant agency. They are acting on behalf of the cognizant agency. So we had a conversation and some emails with FEMA, and they had one of their attorneys asking the question on behalf of FEMA, and that's their conclusion. I haven't heard if they've decided that they wanted to accept those rates. But I haven't been involved in any conversations where they've come back to FHWA to ask our opinion on whether or not they should utilize the A&I rates. And ultimately, this puts the local agencies in an awkward position because they have, an approved rate from A&I, which, we accept as FHWA, a federal agency, but now there's another federal agency coming in saying that they're not going to accept that rate. So that, like I said, puts the local agency in kind of a awkward position. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to chime in with.
No, I appreciate that, Rodney. So it sounds like the final decision was it's up to FEMA. And so now, I don't know if there's, this is back to Daniel was asking the question, is there anything Federal Highway could do? It sounds like we've already kind of done some basic analysis. The next thing would be to ask FEMA what is it about the rate that they're not going to accept? Is it just that it wasn't approved by a cognizant agency, or do they have some issue with the rate? That would be, because if it's just, hey, it wasn't approved by a cognizant agency, we should be able to go out there and show them that that's not a requirement. If they get less than 30, I have no idea what the FEMA amount is. If the FEMA funding was more than 35 million, then that puts them right into the requirement to have a approved indirect cost allocation plan. So that could be one of their issues too, but I have no idea what the amount was that they received.
And I think at the Dan Parker level, he's had this conversation with FEMA, outside of California. So,
Okay, maybe I'll talk to Dan. I know we didn't probably answer your question exactly the way you wanted, Daniel, but we'll do a little bit more digging and see if we can find out some more information.
No, you both did an excellent job actually of answering the question. I don't think I asked it very clearly, but you picked up right off the bat on what I was asking and getting to. And another concern, because this isn't actually the pass-through funds from the Division of Local Assistance within Caltrans. It was another division, but I see this potentially hitting our division too. So it's in my interest to understand what steps we need to take to mitigate or correct the situation. But another concern I have too is, what if, and I didn't get that far involved into it, is what if FEMA actually puts into the agreement stating that, hey, you know what, if you're going to charge an indirect cost rate, we need to approve it, regardless of the cognizant agency, because that does seem like it would be applicable from, I think it's 2 CFR 200.209, where they're putting in an award requirement into it too. So I can foresee that happening as well, and would create some consternation and some difficulties between Caltrans acting as the cognizant agency and then additional requirements being put on for one of our local partners who are seeking additional federal aid, especially from FEMA when it is an emergency situation.
Yeah, and then the other thing to keep in mind, and it just came to my head just now, is if we think about when you, and we talked about this yesterday, and this is the importance of extraordinary expenditures. So let's say a local government, and we'll just use this same example, Caltrans has approved an indirect rate for this local government. Let's just say it's 10% or whatever, and their base is total direct costs, and it's a 10% rate, and then there's an emergency event. Wouldn't that emergency event, if we charge that 10% and that whatever the cost or value of that emergency event was, let's say it was, $20 million or whatever, if we just charge the 10% of that $20 million, it was never ever included in the original base, we would overbill our indirect costs. So we also need to think about, because that could also be what FEMA is saying is, and we do that in Federal Highway all the time. My example yesterday, when there was an earthquake in Alaska, they should not charge their normal indirect rate to those ER events because it would cause them to overbill indirect costs. Unless they can show that their indirect costs significantly increased due to this ER event, then it may not be equitable to charge their rate to a FEMA project that you know, they weren't expecting to have because it was an emergency event. So those are the other things that we need to keep in mind and let the local government know, because really in the end, the intent of an indirect rate is to be able to get reimbursed indirect costs, actual true indirect costs that are being incurred on federal projects. And so, yes, there could be indirect costs being incurred on an ER project, but you know, is it going to be significant enough to charge 10% to a big ER event that's going to possibly make them overbill indirect costs in the end? So just keep those things in mind, and that's part of the negotiation, which kind of brings us to our next part of today's discussion is once we've looked at all of this stuff, now we have to do the negotiation. Now we need to, and this goes into all of the things that have just been brought up with these questions. You know, do we have to talk to another federal awarding agency? You know, are they excluding out extraordinary expenditures? If there's something that's coming in that they want to charge cost to, was that, if it's a extraordinary cost, it shouldn't be billed unless it was accounted for in their base, because it's going to make them over collect. And so those are the things that we also need to keep in mind. And it did come to my head when we were talking about FEMA money is, you know, most of the time that's not planned for funding, and most often ER funds are not usually charged indirect rates unless you have a special rate just specifically for that ER event. And in that case, I would say the local government should work with FEMA and say, hey, then we want to develop our own indirect rate just for this event. We've already identified, you know, some of our costs, or however they want to do it. And then they could negotiate with FEMA and develop their own rate just for that FEMA event. That could be another option that you could recommend. All right.
That was a great discussion. Great questions, Margaret, Daniel, and thanks for chiming in, Rodney. Anybody else have a
Jonathan.
question about, you know, what they're dealing with regards to indirect costs?
Jonathan Cox here, and a discussion we could maybe have later, but I just want to bring it up when you have that screen up with the Appendix 7 D1B. So one of the concerns I had was within the context of 200-414, with the exception of those non-federal entities described in Appendix 7 D1B, is reading the first and second sentence separately, particularly because, you know, the C section describes the Indian governments as different requirements, but the non-federal entities described within D1B are both those are state and local. Yes, there's the requirement to submit for the 35 million, but then there's the requirement for the state and locals to still create an indirect cost rate proposal. And within the context of the definition in the 2 CFR, which defines that as what's described in the appendices, and the Appendix 7 goes on to describe the documentation of the proposal. So just the concern that it's, in my opinion, at least, it was never the intent to have the de minimis for state and local governments. And I think there's other concerns in terms of having a plan like that, especially entities that, you know, want to have one plan that sort of covers all, where that may be allowable for federal funding. But, you know, specifically in my prior experience with Department of Finance and looking at other, you know, more state awards from like natural resources, is how that's supported in an audit, right? A de minimis. Certainly they should still have an allocation plan in place to be able to show how they can allocate costs to a specific project. But again, it can kind of go on, but I think because you had that screen up, I just wanted to bring it up in terms of how within the context of what's said within 200-414F, and then reading D1B, which basically describes the local and state as both required to prepare. It's just the submission or not. Mm-hmm. And especially for us, we require the submission regardless of the funding for approval. But maybe that's something we can talk about later. We just wanted to bring it up.
No, I think that's a good idea. And I know, Jonathan, you had said that you'd want to set up a meeting to visit with Rodney, Eric, and I. And so we can definitely do that.
Okay.
But it is confusing. And when we go out and do this training, and it's confusing for other people as well, because it's a little bit vague, but you have to always just keep in mind what those cost principles say. And basically what that is saying is if an entity wants to claim indirect costs, it's up to them if they want to. If many entities don't claim indirect costs, they just say, hey, we'll pay for those with our state or local monies, and we're only going to bill or charge to the federal government direct costs, and that's fine. But if an entity wants to claim indirect costs, then, like you said in 414, it identifies what is an indirect cost. It says if an entity wants to claim a de minimis rate of 10%, they can, as long as they receive less than 35 million in direct federal funding and they don't currently have an indirect rate. And then, like you said, Jonathan, that 10%, it can be used indefinitely. They don't have to have a plan. But like you said, they do have to show that they're only going to charge that 10% to the allowable costs, and that they have a process in place where they're not going to charge the 10% to those excluded items. And that could be on a bill by bill basis, and they don't necessarily have to have a plan, which I agree with you. It would be good for them to have a plan, but 2 CFR 200 very specifically says the reason why they do the de minimis is so there doesn't have to be a big comprehensive plan. What there does need to be is a certification every year that they still meet the requirements to claim a de minimis rate. I would say that is a minimum. Did they receive more than 35 million in direct federal fundings? If they do, then they can no longer charge 10%. It's done. They can't be a de minimis anymore. They either can't claim indirects at all, or they have to develop a full-blown ICAP and submit it to their cognizant agency for indirect cost. So that's the things that we need to keep in mind, but we can have a separate discussion on that offline.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Anyone else have a topic they'd like to bring up? And that's the ICAP negotiation, which is pretty much the last thing you're going to be doing. And the things to keep in mind are what you see on the slide. We've talked a little bit about that historical background and information, looking at that organization, seeing if they've had any problems with their single audits or other findings or observations that have been identified in the past, because that would indicate some problematic areas with regards to possibly applying that rate, or quite often even developing it. So, there's a little bit that you've got to look into there when you get to this negotiation period, and, making sure that everything's accurate. Specifically with the predetermined rate, Bob showed us a great example today with YDOT, where they had a much higher indirect cost rate that was much higher indirect cost than what they wanted to claim. So, and YDOT doesn't have any historical background of any of these problems. It just was their choice to do so. But with regards to smaller organizations or definitely ones that are submitting ICAP for the first time, you might want to take a look at them and ask them some questions. Obviously, everything has to be complete. The supporting documents that we talked about, their financial system capabilities, the type of rate that's being considered. And this just kind of goes to the fact of, what type of organization are they? What type of rate is best? We mentioned provisional is really not the go-to thing if you've got multiple grants, because it's administrative burdensome, things of that nature that we've already talked about. The length of the time of the agreement, like Vermont, even though they did a predetermined rate and could have done it up to 4, because this was their first time, we went for a 2-year and said, we want to keep an eye on it and we'll revisit it over a 2-year period of time, just to make sure everything that you're presenting is working out in the wash, basically. And then any other deliverables going forward. So that's the final step, is when you get into negotiations and you start discussing, exactly what rate you're going to be doing. I want to share another screen here as we start to close out. And that's the description of this course, and this will just be a quick, let me see if I can come out of this PowerPoint here real quick. And I'll just bring this over and explode it. But this was a description of our course. I just want to run through some stuff real quick. Stewardship and oversight, that first day that we talked about, all the responsibilities and all the various regulations and stuff, the resources that we provided, all that stuff is the overarching stuff you should always keep in mind. Any policies that we have, which were very minimal, we basically follow 2 CFR 200. We do have a question from Grace from the FHWA office that talks about where's the reference for where you can't just charge all of your indirect costs to one project. And Grace, we'll get back to you on that one. I just wanted to let you know that Bob and I are aware of it and are working on it. We beat up pretty good the differences between indirect and direct costs, I think. And we talked about the pools, and we showed you examples of how those various pools were created. Allowable costs through the cost principles, very, very important to understand that and ensure once you can start looking at those cost pools that, there aren't any unallowable costs, hidden in there that maybe that organization is not aware of, that they're unallowable. The various factors for claiming, we talked about that, the different types of rates, and the different types of bases, and how important it is to recognize what base is going to work for that organization. And then Bob hit the centralized services really good, and how that should look and how they're allocated in your ICAP. And then today we talked about using the review guide for those supporting documentations when you're reviewing an ICAP. And like Bob said, we recommend to everybody, all the DOTs, because they are cognizant agencies for our local public agencies and other organizations. And we always recommend, hey, take that as your foundation and create your own checklist for when you're reviewing ICAP. So that's something we recommend to everyone as well. Understanding the cognizant agency and the approval process, that's pretty simple on the approval process, but understanding cognizant agency, as we heard some of these questions that everybody brought up just a few minutes ago, I think we get more questions on determining cognizant agency and who's responsible for, reviewing and approving. We get more questions in that specific area than any of these other principles that we talk about. All these other principles we talked about, once you understand them, they're very straightforward. But the cognizant agency, and it's not just FEMA. We've dealt with FTA and other federal organizations, and like Bob said, sometimes those guidelines are fairly confusing. So that's an ongoing struggle that we as a federal agency have with our sister agencies out there as well. Applying that ICAP is really important. That organization has to be able to apply that rate exactly how their methodology explains. And, it has to be accurate and allocable allocations of their indirect costs. And then, of course, Bob kind of summarized those review things in a checklist, and we highly recommend that.